My name is Connor Dodge, and today I'm going to be discussing the Great Migration and what life was like for Black Americans who went north. For the presentation interview, I'm going to be talking about what the Great Migration was, why the Black Americans moved north, what their life was like in the northern cities, the impacts that the Great Migration had on culture and society, and the legacy of the Great Migration. Now, what was the Great Migration? Well, the Great Migration was one of the largest internal movements of people in the United States history, and it happened roughly between the 1910s and the 1970s, where about 6 million Black Americans left the South and moved to the North, Midwest, and West. Now, the migration wasn't just about moving for jobs or education. It was really a search for safety, freedom, and a better quality of life. And many of the people who did migrate wanted to escape the harsh realities of the Jim Crow laws, racial violence, and the limited opportunities it had in the South. Now, this movement occurred in two main phases, which historians often link to the two world wars. And during the first phase, from around 1910 to 1940, Black Americans moved primarily to cities like New York, Chicago, Detroit, and Pittsburgh, which we're going to talk about later. And the factories and industrial jobs in these cities offered opportunities that were largely unavailable in the South, especially during a time where the European immigration had slowed and the men were sent off to fight in World War I. Now, by the second phase, which followed World War II, even more people moved, not only north, but also to the Midwest cities and West cities like Los Angeles, Oakland, San Francisco, Portland, and Seattle. Now, over time, these migrations reshaped the population of the United States, and that had lasting social, cultural, and economic impacts. And the Great Migration also laid the foundation for future movements and political changes, and also includes cultural developments in African American communities across the country. Now, we're going to talk about the push factors. So, why did they leave the South? Why did the Black Americans leave the South? One of the biggest ones was to evade the Jim Crow laws and their strict racial discrimination. These laws enforced strict racial segregation in schools, public spaces, transportation, and that severely limited the personal freedoms and opportunities that they had. Racial violence was obviously another major factor, and families lived with a constant threat of lynching, intimidation, and attacks, making everyday life feel unsafe and on edge. Now, the economic conditions also pushed people to leave, where most of African Americans in the South were trapped in low-paying agricultural work with little chance for advancement, while the cities in the North offered the possibility of earning a more stable income, which doesn't really work out, as we learn later. And above all, the migration was about seeking safety, basic rights, and the freedom to live without the constant oppression. The push factors set the stage for the near 6 million people to move north. Now, we're going to talk about the pull factors. Why did the Black Americans choose to move to the north? The harsh conditions in the South pushed many African Americans to leave northern and Midwestern cities. These Midwestern cities pulled them for new opportunities. The industrial growth during World War I and World War II created a high demand for workers in factories, steel mills, and other industries, often offering higher wages than agricultural work in the South. Now, these cities also offered better educational opportunities for the children and more social freedoms than were available under the strict Jim Crow laws of the South. These families were able to participate more fully in their communities and take advantage of the political and civic opportunities that were largely denied in their southern states. As I mentioned before, the major destinations included cities like Chicago, Detroit, New York, and Pittsburgh during the first stage of the migration, or the first phase. Now, after World War II, the migration expanded westward even more to California cities like Los Angeles, Oakland, San Francisco, as well as Portland and Seattle. Now, moving north not only provided just some economic opportunities, but a chance for African Americans to build safer neighborhoods, create supportive communities, and begin shaping cultural life in their new urban areas. Now, talking about the major cities and migration routes, they moved to the aforementioned cities like Chicago, Detroit, New York, Pittsburgh, and Philadelphia, and that these cities offered industrial jobs, education, and slightly greater social freedoms than in the South. The migrations caused significant demographic shifts. Cities that had small black populations in the early 1900s grew rapidly, and this reshaped neighborhoods and created new communities. On the side of the presentation I have here, I have migration routes. And this highlights how people moved from southern cities to rural areas to urban centers in the north and west. The moving to the north really screwed up the populations, and the cities that they moved to really had a hard time grasping this concept of millions and millions of people moving to their area. And some of them didn't like it very much, and the cities suffered as a result. For the work and economic life in the North. While the African Americans arrived in northern cities, the biggest change they experienced was their economic opportunities. For the first time, many were able to move away from sharecropping and the agricultural labor into industrial jobs. Both of the world wars dramatically increased the demand for industrial labor. With the millions of men fighting overseas and immigration from Europe slowing, companies began hiring black workers to fill essential roles. Now, this economic shift marked the first time that the large numbers of African Americans had access to stable, year-round industrial work. Now, as I mentioned before, the move to the North wasn't all sunshine and rainbows. The opportunities were not free of racism. Black workers were often given the most dangerous or lowest paying positions and were excluded from many labor unions. Even with this, the move north allowed families to save money, purchase homes, and send their children to better schools. Over the time, this laid the foundation for growing black middle class and changed the social and economic fabric of many American cities. For the housing in the neighborhoods. Even after they moved to the North, they faced new forms of discrimination. Not so much low-paying jobs or all of that. The new forms of discrimination came especially when it came to housing. Many of the cities used redlining, which was a practice of denying loans and mortgages to black families based on where they lived. The local governments and real estate developers also used restrictive covenants, which legally prevented black families from buying or renting homes in certain neighborhoods. As a result of this, many families were forced to live in small, overcrowded areas with limited housing options. The rent pricing in these neighborhoods were actually very unfairly high, while the city governments neglected basic infrastructure like the sanitation and the schools. Now, even despite all of these challenges, the black communities in the North developed incredible resilience. They built churches, small businesses, and community organizations that became central to their social and cultural life. These neighborhoods, most popularly known as Harlem in New York or Bronzeville in Chicago, became powerful centers of identity, art, and activism. Now, unfortunately, many of these discriminatory housing policies laid the foundation for more racial segregation and wealthy inequality that still affect American cities today. So even though they moved to the North and things still weren't going their way and they still weren't fair, all of the black families and the black Americans persevered through that and began paving their own way in the North. As I just mentioned before, with their cultural and community life, it didn't just change where people lived, it transformed American culture as a whole. As the millions of black Americans settled in the northern cities, they built strong communities that became centers of creativity and identity. Now, one of the most famous examples of this cultural growth was the Harlem Renaissance in New York City during the 1920s and 1930s. Harlem became a national hub for black artists, writers, and musicians. Some of the figures like Langston Hughes, Zora Neale Hurston, and Duke Ellington expressed the pride expressed the pride, the struggles, and the hopes of Black experience through poetry, literature, and music. In the cities like Chicago and Detroit, jazz and blues also exploded in popularity, influencing American music forever. These cultural music gave voice to a generation that had been long silenced in the South. Beyond art, the Great Migration helped shape new forms of community and activism. Black newspapers and civil rights organizations grew stronger, and the churches, clubs, and businesses built in these cities became vital parts of community life. In many ways, the culture and the community developments born out of the Great Migration helped lay the groundwork for the civil rights movement that would emerge in the 1950s and the 1960s. So again, even though it wasn't all they hoped it to be, they still made the most out of it, and they still very much so changed the culture and community life that we know today in these cities. Talking more about their challenges and discriminations they faced in the North, which they left the South to escape from, it still didn't disappear in the North, and that's a big topic. That's why it's highlighted so much in this, because it was such a shock to the millions and millions of Americans moving that just because they moved, it wasn't even close to being over for them. It didn't disappear. Just the discrimination and the racial activity that happened there, they were just different. And one of the major issues, like I mentioned before, was job competition. And when the black workers entered northern industries, many white workers felt threatened and reacted with anger or violence. Now, this tension boiled over during the Red Summer of 1919, when race riots broke out in more than 24 cities across the country, including Chicago and Washington, D.C. Now, while the segregation wasn't always enforced by law in the North, many cities practiced de facto segregation. And that means like schools, restaurants, neighborhoods were often separated by race in practice, if not by policy. Black families were excluded from certain public spaces and often had to endure racial harassment. Like I've said a million times in this presentation, the Great Migration strengthened the determination of Black Americans to demand equality. They formed community organizations, joined labor unions, and laid the groundwork for future civil rights efforts. Now, the legacy and long-term impact of the Great Migration. The Great Migration permanently challenged and changed the face of America. As millions of Black Americans moved from the South to the North and West cities, they didn't just seek new homes, they helped build new homes and a new national identity. Now, these migrants created strong, thriving communities that became center of art, music, political activism. Like I said, the Harlem Renaissance in New York and the jazz and blues scenes in Chicago and Detroit gave rise to cultural pride and creativity that influenced the entire country. The migration also shifted political power, as Black voters in the North began to have more of an influence in elections, shaping policies and paving the way for the civil rights movement of the 1950s and 1960s. So it was all worth it because they moved to the North and because they persevered, they inspired and they created these civil rights movements to change the way the world looked at them. And this had an effect for a long, long time. Even though the discrimination didn't disappear, the courage and determination of these families inspired lasting progress. In ways like economics, socials, and cultural, the Great Migration laid the foundation for a stronger Black middle class and was a more diverse American society. In short, the Great Migration wasn't just a movement of people, it was a movement of progress and resilience. And its legacy continues to shape our culture, politics, and understanding of equality today. Thank you.